Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message. I want you to take your Bible and turn with me to the book of Job, chapter 4. And I don't want to scare anybody, but my text tonight is chapter 4 through chapter 7. It's really, I wanted to do this because sometimes I think we avoid the book of Job because we don't understand the way it's built. We understand chapters 1 and 2 because it's narrative and it's easy. We understand the last 4 or 5 chapters of the book because it's apocalyptic, and that's something familiar with. But the structure of the poetic sections in the middle, when we have the argument and response from Job's friends to Job, and it goes back and forth 3 different times. So we have 9 different addresses, 1 for each friend, and then Job for each friend, 3 different occasions, while he's sitting on the ash heap. And it's difficult. Of course, the language is hard. Some of the illustrations and illustrative words that are used are not familiar to us. This was really probably a public scene that took place outside of Job's house. When Job went out and scraped himself, which still just gives me the willies to think about, and sat in those ashes, and his friends came and sat around him, I would imagine that a crowd gathered to hear what was going to be said. And I want to begin tonight, and what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to preach every verse or anything. I just wanted to do an overview of the first exchange. So we begin with Eliphaz. Eliphaz is called the Temanite, and his address to Job, and then Job's reply. And what I've done is I've just made a survey, really. So I'm going to go through Eliphaz's address and Job's address, and I want to kind of compare them a little bit. We'll do Eliphaz first, and then we'll do Job. Eliphaz's address is found in chapter 4 and in chapter 5. Job's reply to Eliphaz is in chapter 6 and in chapter 7. So 2 chapters each. We'll see how they compare, how they line up. Some of the things that we'll find out is that they're on 2 different planes. Job and Eliphaz are not really talking to one another. And it's hard because the grief that Job's in, and we'll see some of that as well. So let me begin with verse 1 of chapter 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, If we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. Thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. But now it is come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Is not this thy fear, thy confidence, thy hope, and the uprightness of thy ways? Eliphaz the Temanite. The Temanite is an interesting phrase. The Temanites lived in what was the area occupied by Edom. So the Edomites would have been there at this time. If this is during the period when Israel is sojourning in Egypt, the Edomites would have been thriving in Mount Seir. And this city of Teman, or Tema, he mentions it later on in one of the chapters, Job, in one of his replies, is a great city. And the men of that city, and really of several of the Edomite cities, were considered to be great men of wisdom. So when we have Eliphaz, the Temanite, here mentioned, it's probably to suggest to us that we just don't have anybody sitting there on the ash pile with Job. We happen to have a very wise man from a city of wise men. And so he begins his address. And do you notice his introduction here? I just read it, verses 1 through 6. Is really an introduction of respect. If you listen to his words, and this is why I chose this dialogue before, other than the other ones, because this one really is Eliphaz's address to Job, his first address to Job, is very tender. It's compassionate, although Job completely rejects him, and we'll see that in a minute. But you notice his words, who can withhold himself from speaking? I want to say something to you. You've instructed many, you've strengthened the weak hands, your words have upholden him that was falling. Thou hast strengthened the feeble knees, but now it's come upon thee. So all that you've done in the past to help other people, it's happened to you now. So Eliphaz is saying, I want to replace you in this and help you. I want to be the one to strengthen your knees or your hands. Now it's come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Is not this thy fear? I think that is the fear of every man. Thy confidence, thy hope, and the uprightness of thy ways. Remember, I pray thee, and now we begin the very first point of Eliphaz's address, beginning here in verse 7. Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God they perish. By the breath of his nostrils they are consumed. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the stout lion's whelps are scattered abroad. I think that those last two verses there are specifically for Job. But notice, he begins with this idea of sowing and reaping. What you sow in life, you will reap in life. Now, we have and that's the beauty of Job is there's always a third person in the book of Job. And the third person in this dialogue is you and me. Because we know what happened in heaven. We were the fly on the wall in heaven when God and Satan talked about Job. And we know that there was nothing at all about Job that God said, yeah, you need to do that to him because he's sinned in this way. So we know in the back of our minds, we're hearing God say, have you considered my servant Job? He's an upright man. He's a man that fears me. He's a man that walks in his integrity and eschews evil. So we have that in the back of the mind. And then we hear this wise man, Eliphaz, say, sowing and reaping is in force in Job's life. But we know it's not. Because Job really hasn't done anything to procure the wrath of God against some sin that he has committed. In verse 7 that begins, whoever perished being innocent. Well, Job's not going to perish, so these words are just a little bit out of place. Who were the righteous? Where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. Now, in Job's specific case, this argument does not fit. However, these words are right. Sowing and reaping is a principle that goes back as far as men have been on the planet. And we go back to the very oldest scripture in our Bible, and what we have is that principle being repeated by a wise man somewhere from the land of Edom. And he says, sowing and reaping, that's what happens. He says there in verse 8, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. Absolutely, that's the truth. By the blast of God they perish. By the breath of his nostrils they are consumed. Okay, so he begins with this idea of sowing and reaping. And he's saying to Job, Job, I know maybe you don't know what you've done, but somewhere something has happened. You have plowed iniquity. Now, verses 12 through the end of the chapter, really. In my outline of this, I include the first verse of chapter 5 as well. He quotes this lesson he's learned from a vision that he's had, which is really kind of weird, but it fits into the time period of the literature. He says, now a thing was secretly brought to me, and mine ear received a little thereof. In thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falleth on men, fear came upon me, and trembling which made all my bones to shake. Then a spirit passed before my face, and the hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before mine eyes. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying. Sounds like a ghost story, doesn't it? He's telling a ghost story. But it's a ghost story with a moral point. The Spirit passed by before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before mine eyes. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying, shall mortal man be more just than God? There's the kernel right there of the vision. That's the question. Shall mortal man be more just than God? You see, Job wants to take God to court. He says, I didn't do anything wrong. I want to take God to court and prove that God's in the wrong in bringing this upon me. And so Eliphaz, in this very tender way, tells a little ghost story to Job and says, I heard the Spirit say. It's almost like Job this morning when he was talking about where wisdom is. And Abaddon and Death say, well, we heard a rumor that, God knows the way to wisdom. Well, here we have Eliphaz kind of doing the same thing. And he says, I had this vision of a ghost. And I think I heard the ghost say, shall a mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his maker? Well, the immediate answer to that question is no. Of course not. And we proceed. A man, behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth. They are destroyed from morning to evening. They perish forever without any regarding it. Doth not their excellency which is in them go away? They die even without wisdom. So, does mortal man, is he more just than his maker? Absolutely not. And here's why. His maker knows what he's made of. He knows that he is... Don't you love the language here? This is beautiful language that Eliphaz uses. Lest them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust. That sounds kind of precarious, doesn't it? Which are crushed before the moth. So really, how strong and durable are we? And then, as I said, I've included verse 1 of chapter 5 in this section of Eliphaz's delivery. He says there in verse 1 of chapter 5, call now, if there be any that will answer thee, and to which of the saints wilt thou turn? So he's saying if you want to pray to some holy person who's been holy in the past and more just than his creator, why don't you go ahead and pray to him? Which one are you going to pray to? You can't, because there is nobody like that. So really, you've only got one option, Job, and that is to deal with the Lord. So his little story about the ghost is trying to gently guide Job to call on the Lord. In chapter 5, beginning in verse 2, we have the next section of Eliphaz's delivery. For wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly one. I have seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his habitation. His children are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate. Neither is any to deliver them. Whose harvest the hungry eateth up, and taketh it even out of the thorns, and the robber swalloweth up their substance. Although affliction cometh not forth of the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground, yet man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upward. He makes this his next statement. First is, sowing and reaping are in force. Second is, the lesson from the vision, don't depend on your own holiness. You're not more just than God. Thirdly, the shame of the foolish. They make more trouble for themselves. But notice the last statement there in that section I just read, verse 7, yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. Eliphaz is saying to Job, this is just our lot. It's our lot in life to experience trouble. Every man, whether he's wise or foolish, but the foolish especially, but every man is going to experience trouble. You can't go to any other source for help other than the Lord, but you must understand that this is not unique to you, Job. Every one of us is going to experience trouble. And then I think this is why I love Eliphaz's delivery, because what we have in 8 through 27 of chapter 5 is this really beautiful, tender calling for Job to seek the Lord. I would seek unto God. Don't you love that? He says, Job, and I could just see him patting him. This is what I would do now. I would seek God. You can't seek to some holy man because no one's holy. You can't say this trouble's unique because every man experiences trouble. Here's what you need to do, friend. I would seek unto God. I love that. I want to frame those words and put them in gold letters someplace. That's beautiful. I would seek unto God, and unto God I would commit my cause. Yes, sir. Eliphaz, you got that right. Which doeth great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. who giveth rain upon the earth. Now, he's going to tell all these marvelous things, and he begins with the created order. He gives rain upon the earth, sends waters upon the fields, sets up on high those that be low, and those which mourn be exalted into safety. So we have this generalization of God's blessing. Verse 12, he disappoints the devices of the crafty so that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. So he's against the evil man. He taketh up the wise in their own craftiness, and in the counsel the froward is carried headlong. They meet with darkness in the daytime, and grope in the noontime as in the night. But he saveth the poor from the sword, and from their mouth, and from the hand of the mighty. So this is the greatness of God. This is what he does. He blesses and he protects. So the poor hath hope, and iniquity stoppeth her mouth. So Eliphaz says, seek God because he does wonderful things. And then he just lists a few of the wonderful things God does. One of my favorite out of that, besides verse 8, is when he says, he disappointeth the devices of the crafty. I love that statement. So that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. Lots of devices, lots of evil, wicked devices. And the Lord stops them because he does good things. That's why we should seek him. And then we have at the end of his delivery here, 17 through 27, some more of this about God delivering. And we have this wonderful statement in 17, which begins the last section of Eliphaz's statement here. 17 through 27. He says, behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. And everybody said, yeah, really? I just did a psalm for Daily Dose. I think it was Psalm 94. Psalm 94, verse 12. Blessed is the man whom thou chasteneth, O Lord, and teachest him out of thy law. There it is again. The psalmist even tells us there is a blessedness in the chastening of the Lord. And of course, that it comes over into the New Testament. What son is there that the father doesn't chasten? So here we have it in Job. Blessed is the man, he says in verse 17. Blessed is the man who is corrected. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty. So Eliphaz recognizes what's happened to Job, and this kind of connects his whole discourse now because he began with sowing and reaping. And this, what's happened to you is bad because God is judging what you've sown. But don't despise it because it's really a blessing that God does this. Verse 18, he makes sore and bindeth up, he woundeth, and his hands make whole. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles, yea, in 7. There shall no evil touch thee. In famine he shall redeem thee from death. In war from the power of the sword. Sounds like Psalm 91 there, doesn't it? Another shades of the psalm. Thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue, neither shalt thou be afraid of destruction when it cometh. Yep, Psalm 91. At destruction and famine thou shalt laugh, neither shalt thou be afraid of the beasts of the earth. Notice this, he even changes the course of the created order for the one who's blessed. Thou shalt be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with thee. That's how much God blesses the man that he chastens. And thou shalt know that thy tabernacle shall be in peace, and thou shalt visit thy habitation, and thou shalt not sin. Thou shalt know also that thy seed shall be great, and thine offspring as the grass of the earth. Thou shalt come to thy grave at full age, like a shock of corn cometh in his season. Lo, this we have searched it, so it is, hear it, and know thou it for thy good. Prescription has been given. And that last statement there in verse 24, we know this, we've searched it out. That is, again, that quality control. We've made sure that this is right. So this is a good pill to take. Hear it, know thou it for thy good. Well, how does Job swallow the pill? He doesn't really like it very much. But you can see in Eliphaz's address to Job, it's loving, it's respectful. He's trying to direct him in the right way because Eliphaz doesn't have all the information. He is giving us the wisdom as he has it. And really, there's a lot here that's really, really good. A lot that's really great here. And when he comes to the end, he probably thinks, nobody else has to say anything. I've figured it out. Job's done. So Job begins in chapter 6. In verses 2 through 7, we have Job's opining his sorrowful condition. verses 2 through 7, he is, "Oh, my grief were thoroughly weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances together. For how would it be heavier than the sand of the sea? Therefore my words are swallowed up." It's just so bad. And he says, "For the arrows of the Almighty are within me. The poison thereof drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me." See, now he's still blaming God for this, because that's what he knows. Verse 5, "Doth the wild ass bray when he has grass, or loweth the ox over his fodder? Can that which is unsavory be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? The things that my soul refused to touch are as my sorrowful meat." He is opining his condition. He's angry at God. We can understand that, can't we? Been there, know that feeling, that bitterness that's in your mouth because of the condition that you're in. And you wonder why God is silent. You wonder why things don't seem to be changing. You wonder why there's no remedy for the condition. And that's Job. He is bitter. He's sorrowful. He's a little whiny here, if you just want to be honest about it. But that's okay. We understand. He's scraped his body with that potsherd and sitting in that pile of ashes, and the pain must be unbearable. And so we say to Job, when he responds this way to Eliphaz, okay, understood. We got that. But then Job's sorrow takes a nosedive, because he repeats what he said in chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. He says, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant me the thing that I've longed for, even that it would please God to destroy me." See, he wants to die. And again, we understand that as well. People who are in chronic pain, they just want it to end. They want the trouble to be over. And it's not like he just has trouble. He's lost everything and now is in excruciating pain, physical pain, and he just wants it to end. He doesn't want to think anymore. He doesn't want his heart to take another beat. He just wants it to all come to a close and his eyes be darkened and it all be over. So 8 through 12, we have Job repeating this desire for death. "That I should have comfort, yea, I would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. What is my strength, that I should hope? What is mine end, that I should prolong my life?" And then there beginning in verse 14, Job attacks Eliphaz. He despises the advice of Eliphaz. 14 through 30. "To him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend. But he forsaketh the fear of the Almighty. My brethren have dealt deceitfully as a brook, and as the stream of brooks they pass away." And then he describes the brook that dries up after the ice is melted. In verse 18, "The paths of their way are turned aside. They go to nothing and perish. The troops of Tema look," there's Tema, "the companies of Sheba waited for them. They were confounded because they had hoped. They came thither and were ashamed. For now ye are nothing. Ye see my casting down and are afraid. Did I say, Bring unto me, or give a reward for me of your substance, or deliver me from the enemy's hand, or redeem me from the hand of the mighty?" See, he's complaining about what Eliphaz has had to say. So this entire discourse, all the way through the end of chapter 6, is, you guys are worthless. You're not really my friends. Which also is understandable, isn't it? He opines his condition, his sorrowful plight. He wants to die, and then he turns to his friends and bites at them and says, you guys are not really my friends. If you were my friends, you would have come here to comfort me. And he kind of attacks a little bit there. So all the way through verse 30. And then the last chapter is verse 7. Job talks about three things. The brevity of man's life and its vanity, or two things rather. The brevity of man's life and its vanity, and his charge against God, which really 11 through 21 you could frame as a prayer, that he turns from Eliphaz and his friends and he looks to heaven and he makes this address not to Eliphaz, but he makes it to the Lord. So verses 1 through 10, we have the brevity of man's life. Is there not an appointed time to man upon earth? Are not his days also like the days of an hireling, as a servant earnestly desireth the shadow And as a hireling looketh for the reward of his work, so am I made to possess months of vanity, and wearisome nights are appointed to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? And the night be gone, and I am full of tossing to and fro unto the dawning of the day. Now notice verse 5. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. I think this is a very accurate description of his condition physically. He's scraped those boils, he's seated in the dust, and his body now, the skin is beginning to fester. The idea of sitting in those ashes is that the pH in those ashes would draw out the poison in his skin. But you have to change bandages, and he's still sitting there. And so I think this is a description of over and over again, those boils, even though they're not boils anymore, they're still festering. And so his pain is still continuing. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is wind. Mine eyes shall no more see good. The eye of him that seeth me shall see me no more. Thine eyes are upon me, and I am not. As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. Therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. If this was a psalm in the Psalter, we would call it a psalm of complaint, a prayer of complaint to God. And I think that's pretty much what we have here in verses 11. When he begins in 11, I will not refrain my mouth. I think he turns from Eliphaz. Now he turns to the Lord, and he says, here's my problem. Here's my complaint. I'm going to spill it. Am I a sea or a whale that thou settest a watch over me? This is his complaint to God. And he says, you watch me, you pursue me, you never leave me alone. If you just leave me alone, I'd be okay. When I say my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint, then thou searchest me or scarest me with dreams and terrifiest me through visions, so that my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my life. I loathe it. I would not live always. Let me alone, for my days are vanity. Wow, what an honest prayer that is. And you can hear the anguish of his heart. 18 through 21 really just completes the prayer. How long, we have in verse 19, this should be in the Psalter. How long wilt thou not depart from me, nor let me alone till I swallow down my spittle? Dr. John D.W. Watts, one of my professors in seminary, one of the greatest minds of theology that ever lived, he wrote part of the commentary on the book of Job. And in that commentary, he says this statement here in verse 19, till I swallow down my spittle, is actually an Arabic proverb that Job has brought in to describe his condition. He wants to die. He wants God to leave him alone and let him die. And so he quotes this Arabic proverb and includes it in this prayer. I have sinned. What shall I do unto thee? O thou preserver of men, why hast thou set me as a mark against thee, so that I am a burden to myself? And why dost thou not pardon my transgression and take away mine iniquity? For now I shall sleep in the dust, and thou shalt seek me in the morning, but I shall not be. He wants to die. He wants God to leave him alone, and he says as much to God in this very honest, very open prayer. Now, you can see between these two, between Eliphaz and Job, they really are not on the same wavelength. Eliphaz is trying to comfort Job in this moment. And he says, in the end, there's only one place you can go, and that's to God. Seek him. Because God does wonderful things, Job. If you've sown iniquity and you're reaping the judgment of the Lord, that's okay. Seek God. Because blessed is the man that's chastened by him, who's corrected by him. It's okay. This is our condition. Trouble is our condition. Just seek the Lord. Job just knocks that out. He says, that is not even about what I'm today. He says, you don't understand my sorrow. You don't understand the depth of my misery. I just want to die. You guys are mean. You don't listen to me. You're not telling me something that I need to hear. And by the way, my life is nothing but vanity anyway. And he turns to God and he complains. just leave me alone. This is just some of the most honest, beautiful literature here in the book of Job. There's so much truth here, but even in the midst of all the truth that is in both Eliphaz's statements and in Job's statements, they're missing the mark. And they continue to miss the mark. Through the entire book of Job, Job and his friends never connect, ever connect. And the more they talk, the worse it gets, which really is kind of the way with talking, you know. The more we talk, the worse we go. The further down the garden path we wander. And that's exactly what happens here. And so everyone's sitting around listening to this, and people are, they're keeping score. Well, Eliphaz missed it, and Job didn't hear it, and so they're listening to all this going on. But I just think it's wonderful, and it's very real. I'm hoping that it spoke to you as much as it did to me.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.